Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hi, listeners. It's Lindsay Smith Rogers. Last week, thousands of employees were abruptly dismissed from the FDA, including Dr. Peter Marks, the lead regulator of vaccines and other biologics. Dr. Robert Califf served as the FDA commissioner under Presidents Barack Obama and Joe Biden. He joins Dr. Josh Sharfstein, who was a former principal deputy commissioner at the FDA under President Obama, to talk about the latest developments and what they mean for the agency, for drug development, and for patient care. A reminder that these podcasts are a conversation between the participants and do not represent the position of Johns Hopkins University. Let's listen.
Dr. Robert Califf, thank you so much for coming back to Public Health on Call to talk to me about FDA. How are you?
Personally doing well, but I'm very worried about where we are as a country and where our public health is headed.
Well, I want to start with a statement that you made following an enormous number of people being let go at the Food and Drug Administration. You said FDA, as we've known it, is finished. And I wanted to start by asking you to explain what you meant.
Well, over the years, I think a number of us have become comfortable with the idea that there are a set of laws that dictate that for medical products, that there's an assessment of risk and benefit before a product gets on the market, and that will be judged by a group of civil servants who don't have a financial conflict of interest, but really uphold a professional standard for looking at evidence. In other parts of FDA, there's similar things, but medical products is easiest to talk about because it's probably the most deeply founded in law and tradition. This enables the ecosystem of innovation and discovery science and formation of companies to have a relatively predictable course. Now, because most things that people invent don't work, predictable means that you got to have the evidence, and if your evidence shows the benefit outweighs the risk, then you're on the market. We could talk a long time about after that, there are things to do. But basically, when you take out all the leaders with experience for practical purposes, and then a huge number of people in intermediate spots who help manage all those circumstances that bring the evidence together, and then you say the person in charge of it all, the Secretary of HHS, is widely advocating unscientific concepts. I don't know how you can have any confidence that this sort of thing that many people have taken for granted, that is an FDA that's far from perfect, but provides a basis for clearly the number one innovation engine, the country that's producing the vast majority of medical products that make a difference. It's just not where it was and can't be taken for granted.
Yeah, I think your point about revisiting assumptions about what we thought the country expected and wanted from FDA, it's a very difficult moment. I want to talk about some of the actual actions that have happened at FDA, the leadership changes, the offices that have been eliminated, and more generally, what it means to eliminate so many people from an agency that has accomplished so much. So let's start with the leadership changes. Many people have read about Peter Marks leaving as the lead regulator for biologics, but there are other leaders who were abruptly dismissed. This is a pretty important level of management within FDA. Would you agree?
Yes, of course, because, if we just, again, stick to the pre-market segment, as products are developed, a lot of nuances involved, and there's a lot of guidance that occurs across FDA from teams meeting together and meeting with the sponsors developing products to try to get it right. If you don't have experienced people in those jobs, big mistakes can be made.
Let's talk about maybe a few of the other positions that have been vacated besides the head of biologics. Which ones are top of mind for you?
Well, I think, it's a mixture of people who saw trouble coming and decided to leave, and people who have been asked to leave. But if you look across the leadership of FDA, the head of the Center for Drugs is no longer there. The chief medical officer is no longer there. The chief science officer and principal deputy is no longer there. Now, there's an acting chief science officer who's quite good, so sort of okay with that one. Center for Tobacco Products leadership is gone. And remember, the chief medical officer is dealing with combination products, a very hot, evolving area. And then you look at the offices of policy in most of the centers, they've been disbanded, and almost all the communications effort has been just summarily disbanded. So who's going to notify people when there's an outbreak or a problem with a product?
Yeah, I want to talk about those offices. Before we get there, I just want to also point out that not too long ago, the head of the food program resigned too. So it really is an enormous loss of leaders across the agency. But then you brought up these offices, the policy offices, the communications offices. Now, some people wonder, like, what is policy being made within the FDA? The way I think about that is that there are new kinds of products being developed all the time, and how best to regulate them, how to know, how to assess the benefits, whether the benefits exceed the risk. Those are policy questions. And when FDA is really working, those policy offices help companies figure out how to do the right research to figure out whether those products have value. How do you think of policy offices? Do you think that's fair, what I said? And what would you add?
Yeah, I do. I mean, you know a lot about this. Thanks for bringing up food. Maybe that's a particularly sore one for me since I spent most of my time the last 2 years working and doing, before what's just happened, the largest reorganization in the history of the FDA. And we found a great leader, Jim Jones, who had a history of working with chemicals at EPA and just was perfect for the job. But he didn't see how he could get his job done, as he publicly said, given all the cuts that were made. The way I look about the policy thing, and this also relates to what I've been hearing, that there's a reorg plan being floated that would put all the medical product centers into one organization. And I'm sure a lot of people have thought about that. I certainly thought about it quite a bit because whenever you have multiple organizations doing similar things, it's pretty easy to see the synergies that might occur across those organizations. But when you talk about policy related to drugs or policy related to devices or policy related to food, there's a huge amount of content expertise that's needed, and the laws are not the same.
I remember being invited on a panel once where there was an innovative a scientist who was trying to develop a cell type of therapy that was sort of like generating organ tissue in the lab and potentially using that for all kinds of different drug discoveries. And the reason I was on the panel is because the organizers thought that FDA was holding that technology back. And when we actually got on the panel, what she said was, thank God for the FDA, because it's the FDA that's helping me understand how to look at this new technology, how to think about the safety of this technology so I can be sure that it's safe, how to test it correctly, and that my relationship with FDA is really making this development possible. And I think of that as the policy office is playing a critical role.
Completely agree. And I think it's hard for people not involved in it to understand, but I feel like the regulated industries actually understand it quite well because they live in it. If you accrue a body of experts within FDA, they work across the industry in that area to help the industry develop products that are safe and effective and to help them avoid mistakes, remembering that a lot of this involves very complicated human experiments. You have to do clinical trials in human beings, and you don't want to be making the same mistake that some other company made 3 years ago that you wouldn't necessarily know anything about if you were starting out. So this residual knowledge with an FDA is a very important thing. And I think history, I think, will show that this is a big mistake, partly for that reason.
You mentioned the communications offices being wiped out across FDA, and the logic being don't worry, we'll have communications, but it'll be at the department level. Now, you and I know some of those people who've worked in communications at FDA for a long time. Can I ask you how you would explain what they bring to the task compared to someone who's hired fresh off the street?
Well, if you're going to communicate about, let's say, biologics, you're communicating to the general public in some general ways. That could go okay at the departmental level. But you're also communicating to patient communities, to industries that have a lot of different levels of expertise, and there are people within those communities who are very important. If you don't know who they are and you miss the mark on your communication, it can really backfire on you. And in addition, just knowing what language to use can be extremely difficult with these complicated things. And a generalist, I don't know how they could possibly deal with some of the specialty issues within FDA. Now, I do want to acknowledge, Josh, and I think you'd probably agree with me. There's always room for efficiency in the communications part, and sometimes the centers tend to get a little have gotten protective of their own turf when it was better to be more open. But that's very different than saying we're just going to have a central organization that does it all. That's been tried and it just hasn't worked.
We've discussed over the years, you and me, the opportunities for FDA to become more transparent. And the communications office plays a really important role in that, really helping to explain how decisions are made, as does the Freedom of Information Act office, which I understand also sustained some pretty serious cuts. It's hard for me to imagine how the agency can effectively advance a transparency agenda with a lot of these people leaving.
Yeah, I know that people have often thought about the FOIA, which, the average person listening to this wouldn't have any earthly idea what we're talking about. But, you have a right as a citizen to petition the government for information. But that information has to be redacted because we also have intellectual property laws and protection of human information. And so that redaction has to be done very carefully. And it's different for different commodities because the laws are different. So centralizing that office, there are parts of it, like the use of AI, could be tremendously helpful there and make the work of the human beings better, but there's still going to be human judgment in interpreting what's okay. And I think we've already seen in the first 2 months of this administration, when you turn AI loose without content experts, you get some pretty crazy things coming out of the hopper.
Well, that's definitely one way to put it. I want to circle back. We talked about the leadership. We talked about the offices getting wiped out. And then there are just a lot of people. They may have jobs like booking travel or other basic administrative tasks who were dropped without any explanation, locked out of the office, some of them showing up at FDA and maybe being given the chance to be escorted to take their stuff out of the office. You and I know a lot of these people too, many of whom have devoted their careers to the agency. And, you know, in a way, that story gave me some of the most heartburn because it's really great to see somebody who truly believes in the mission of FDA and is working in all kinds of different ways to make the work of the agency possible. And the fact that so many of those people were so abruptly let go is tough.
I mean, I divide this into several buckets. One bucket is just how you treat your fellow human beings, and I would call the way this was done as inhumane. And the thing is, it's unnecessary. I've always in my career worked in organizations that did large clinical trials where contracts come and go, and then you end up being unable to pay people and you have to reduce the workforce. There are ways to do this that are very humane and help people find jobs, but you don't have to lock them out of their offices and send them anonymous emails firing them and provide no counseling or help in getting the next job. So that's one bucket. The second bucket was where the right things done, the right cuts made, and this a lot of this just makes no sense. I mean, imagine I spent a lot of time with we call them investigators at FDA, as you know, known as the inspectorate in general. I was an inspectee multiple times in my career doing different things. And imagine an inspector trying to, book a trip to South America to do an important inspection. And now the people that know how to use the travel agency are gone and know what all the rules are about what can be booked and what can't, and where the hotels are that are okay. It's just a nightmare of just trying to think about how routine everyday work is going to be done. And then, of course, to do the inspection, you got to have all the background information about the manufacturer, the products. Many of those people are no longer there. So I think the system is crippled in the short term, and it'll be interesting to see what the plan is to fix it.
And one of the points you just mentioned is sometimes the money's gone and you have to let people go. In this case, the money actually isn't gone. So there was no reason, if you were going to make changes, to make them this abruptly.
Couldn't agree more. Makes no sense to me if there is a purpose that we can all understand, but I haven't heard it articulated at this point.
I want to ask you about interference with the work of the agency and whether that is a concern of yours. Over history, there have been moments when outside interests have tried to change what FDA does. In my experience, those days were called Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. There's so many decisions FDA is making. So many different people have an interest in them. They're constantly lobbying one way or the other, suing the agency. And one of the things that makes FDA great is its independence, its spine. How do you think about that challenge today?
Yeah, I am a cardiologist, so I tend to think of things in cardiology terms. But to me, you've got the atria, which are a society out there in atrial fibrillation all the time with just totally erratic, no particular rhythm, just things happening all the time. The commissioner's office really is the AV node. It's the area that makes order of all those extra heartbeats and ends up with a rhythmic heartbeat that the ventricles can pump the blood around in the heart. And so, yeah, as commissioner or during your time, you get calls every day from people wanting to interfere. And your job is to protect the civil service so they can do their work. And I've also widely used the referee construct that there's a set of rules that Congress writes, and that's where politics and policy really should play out. Those are political issues and decisions. But once a rule book is written, the civil servants should be left alone to do their work according to the rule book and not interfered with. This would be like having the owners of the team correcting the referee's calls in midstream in a sport. It just shouldn't be allowed. And, but the law does say that there's a hierarchy from president to HHS secretary and then delegation to commissioner. And the commissioner delegates to the center directors as civil servants. So there have been a couple of times in history that you're well aware of where that judgment has been superseded. But on a regular basis and in a way that Peter Marks described, pretty outrageous. And I think anyone in the industry who could be in a situation where a political appointee can just reach down and completely change what's being done or said should be extremely concerned about it, because then we begin to get into a situation where political favoritism decides what products get on the market and not the evidence for benefit and risk.
And what's at stake if that happens? You mentioned for industry, but I also want to ask you about for patients.
Well, for patients, I believe it's a disaster because, and I think there are two fundamental issues in play here from my perspective. The first is that most things don't work, as I've already said. 90% of drugs that get into early clinical human testing don't end up making it to market. So if you think about that, that means 90% of our best ideas, after they've been all the way through preclinical testing, and you got to raise money, which means people have to believe in it. You got to have the institutional review boards and the FDA sign off on it. Still, 9 out of 10 don't make it. So imagine that you open that wide open without the standard of evidence, and people with more influence and power can sway the decisions. You could hurt a lot of people, and it would be very hard to figure out because it wouldn't be in the context of adequate and well-controlled studies. But the second part, which I think is also very important, there's an element of the industries where the regulation keeps the bad guys out. Human suffering is so widespread, and there's, so much good research showing that the way the human brain works, you can be so easily duped into fraudulent schemes that just opening this up would really undercut the people that put in the hard work and the investment to do well-done studies to prove whether their products work or not. So you could see a real return to chaos, which after all is why most of the current statutes of the FDA are in place, because the chaos didn't work too well. It harmed a lot of people. So I think both of those things, most things don't work, so you need a system that sorts it out in a fair way. And the fact that it would undercut, and especially at a time now when we have amazing breakthroughs right on the threshold across the whole spectrum of rare and chronic disease. And again, you and I are focused on medical products here, but you corrected me already that food is a huge part of the FDA. And I just say, we've got to get to healthy and nutritious food. We've got to understand what healthy and nutritious actually means, not use a bunch of slogans as if they represent science.
We have a huge measles epidemic in this country. We have the threat of a new pandemic, influenza. Are you worried about the agency's ability to support a critical public health response needed to save lives?
I think we're in a crisis in that regard right now. If you just, again, read what Peter Marks wrote in his resignation letter, and from everything I've seen, we have an HHS secretary who doesn't believe that vaccines are effective and has actually written that viruses and bacteria don't cause human disease. And here we are. Not only do we have immediate threats, but there are medium-term threats from the fact that climate is still changing and travel is ubiquitous, and there are going to be infectious threats all over the place. And in the midst of all this, the apparatus that does this work has been almost destroyed between the CDC and the FDA.
Dr. Califf, I can't thank you enough for coming to talk to me on Public Health on Call about these challenges, and hope we can check back in with you, hopefully with some better news in the future. Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Grace Fernandez-Ciceri. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Michael Bonfils, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production coordination by Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez-Ciceri. Analytics by Elisa Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.